evening, everybody. I'm Pat Jenny, president of the Salisbury Forum, and on behalf of my colleagues on the board, welcome you this evening to this program on the impacts of declining fertility rates around the globe. We're very happy tonight to have Dr. Michael Geruso and Dr. Dean Spear from the University of Texas at Austin with us to discuss their recent book, After the Spike: Population, Progress, and the Case for People, which, as you noticed, is on sale in our lobby tonight. And they will be discussing their theory that this demographic change is a threat to the well-being of the planet. Let me note that in my welcome letter, I mistakenly used the term birth rate, which actually is the measure of live births per 1,000 people in a certain time period, rather than fertility rate, which means the number of births to 1,000 women of childbearing age, 15 to 44. The current global fertility rate of 2.25 is at its lowest since records have been kept. Closer? Thank you. Global population will decline once the rate goes below 2, as it is in nations housing about 2/3 of the people, of the world's people. Think Italy or the United States, below 2. The Salisbury Forum will start the new year, 2026, with a little magic at our program on February 6th at the Salisbury School. John Brunel will inform us and entertain us with strange stories, amusing anecdotes, and wondrous sleight of hand. On March 27th, we'll return to our more typical sober discussion with Russell Shorto, who is a well-known historian of the American Revolution, who will be discussing his book, Revolution Song, with 2 local history teachers. This is the current book that's being read by the town of Salisbury. Our partners in the March 27th program include the Scoville Memorial Library, the Salisbury Association, the Troutbeck Symposium, and it's supported by Connecticut 250 and part of Salisbury Commemoration 250. And of course, 250 is the number of years since the Declaration of Independence was signed. After 6 years, my term on the Salisbury Forum Board is over, and I am stepping down as president. It's been a really wonderful experience, and I'm very happy to announce that Sarah Tennyson, a member of our board since last year. Sarah, are you here? Well, I think she might still be checking people in. She's a very talented and energetic person, as anybody who knows her realizes, and she runs a successful consulting company and has lived in Salisbury with her husband since 2018. So congratulations to Sarah. Thanks to all of you who have responded very generously in the past month with your donations. There are still a few weeks left in 2025, so if you have not done so, please consider a gift that will support our next year's calendar of events. It's very easy to do. You go to our website, hit the donate button, and there are lots of giving options by check, credit card, appreciated stock donations, PayPal. So thank you again for your support. We truly appreciate it. And now to introduce our speakers. Dr. Michael Geruso served as a senior economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors in 2023 and 24, where he advised on issues of health and demography. Since 2014, he served on the board of an organization called the Research Institute of Compassionate Economics, or r.i.c.e, and he's an affiliate of the National Bureau of Economic Research and the Population Research Center at UT Austin. Amazingly, he holds 3 bachelor's degrees in engineering, political science, and philosophy from Virginia Tech, and he earned his PhD in economics from Princeton, where he met Dr. Dean Spears. They had desks together, apparently, and they've been working together ever since graduate school. Dean Spears is the founding executive director of r.i.c.e, the organization that Dr. Geruso, Mike, is also involved with, and he's director of the Population Wellbeing Initiative at UT Austin. And we learned over dinner that Dr. Spears and his family spend much of their time in India working on maternal and baby health care issues. He has a master's in public health, master's in public affairs, and of course the PhD in economics from Princeton. So please join me in welcoming both of them to the stage.
Well, thank you for that warm welcome. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to the Salisbury Forum for hosting us in this book talk. The moderator of the last book talk I gave yesterday started with a straw poll, asking the audience, how many of you see overpopulation now and into the future as an important challenge? Or how many people see underpopulation now and into the future as an important challenge? And I would just like to repeat that. So if you're willing to humor me, just show of hands, how many people see overpopulation into the future as an important challenge? If you can't tell, that's most of the hands, I think. And how many people think underpopulation into the future is an important challenge? Okay, actually, a lot, and maybe some people raised both hands. That there's risk in any direction. That really could be a totally reasonable position to have. So a lot of times when I hear about population issues in the media in the United States, it's very narrowly focused on the United States. It's very narrowly focused on what happened this year or even this decade. And I want to start our talk today by zooming out in a much broader perspective. So let's look at the world as a whole, and let's look at the long run of human history. For most of human history, there just weren't very many humans around. 10,000 years ago, there were just a few million of us in the world as a whole. That's the number of people that would fit in a large metro area today, like Atlanta. It wasn't until 1800 that we passed 1 billion people for the first time. By 1925, we passed 2 billion people for the first time. And in the 100 years since then, we've doubled and doubled again to our present 8.2 billion people. And all this time, even though the population was growing and growing fast, it turns out that birth rates have been falling. And I think we'll take a moment later to try and make a little bit of sense of those two facts together. The population was soaring upwards, but birth rates were falling. And I think, as evidenced in this straw poll that we started with, for decades, and I certainly grew up hearing these messages, we've heard messages that overpopulation was a challenge for our future. It was a problem that we were facing. But even looking back to, say, 1968, the year that Paul Ehrlich published his book, The Population Bomb, ever since then, birth rates have been falling. Population growth has been positive, but it's been slower and slower and slower. And so what that means is that within a few decades, and it depends on whether you want to take the UN's projections about when this happens, or the University of Washington, or the European demographers at the Institute for Advanced Systems Analysis to ask exactly when this is going to happen. But all of these groups and projections agree that within a few decades, the global population will peak and begin to decline. I'm a professor. These folks are serious researchers and demographers of these places, and so they'll have lots of reasons to care about the fine differences between their projections. But for the purposes of thinking about the biggest term picture of humanity's future, you should think of all of these projections as being basically the same. They tell us that within the next few decades, the global population will peak. Think about a birth rate like 1. So a total fertility rate of 1 means roughly that for every 2 parents, every 1 woman, there will be 1 child in the next generation. That's the birth rate currently in China. It's about the birth rate in Puerto Rico. It's about the birth rate in Chile. It's about the birth rate in Singapore and other places. It's a really useful one to think about because the math becomes so easy we can do it in our heads. If for every 2 people in a parent's generation, there's 1 child, then what that means is, sort of stepping through generations, for 100 people in the first generation, there'll be 50 people in the next, there'll be 25 in the next. And so over the course of 2 generations, something like 60 or 70 years, cohort sizes, the number of people born, are shrinking by 75%. If you want to think about something a little bit closer to home, you can think of a birth rate, a total fertility rate of 1.5. 1.5 is the average birth rate, the average fertility rate in the 115 richest countries in the world, averaging across them. It's a little bit lower than the United States. It's a little bit higher than Europe as a point of reference. In that environment, for 100 people in a grandparent's generation, there'll be about 75 in the next generation and about 55 in the generation after that. So even in birth rates, societies that would feel very similar to living in Connecticut today, populations and cohorts will shrink rapidly over the course of just a few generations. Okay, so returning to the big picture, what does all of this mean when we put it together and we think about the world as a whole? To answer the question of what the future looks like, you need to make some sort of stance. You need to make some sort of assumption about what fertility rates in the future will look like going on beyond just the next few decades that the projections at the UN, from the UN, and from other population projections assume. And so for the sake of illustration, let's imagine a world in which birth rates continued falling from the present global 2.2 something total fertility rate to 1.6, which is the number for the United States today. What would that sort of future look like? That would be a future, although it would be brought about by something that felt totally normal. The fertility rates that are common in the United States today and are even lower in many other places in the world. That would be a future in which the human population globally would decline about as fast as it's risen over the past couple of centuries. So that's the starting point for our book. Once birth rates fall low, below 2 kids per 2 adults, and stay low, then each generation will be smaller than the last. That's global depopulation. It's the starting point of this conversation tonight. It's fine, I won't go back. And so in that conversation, I'm going to bring up my co-author on this, Dean Spears.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for being here. Thanks, Mike, for getting us started.
Yeah, so I think a nice place to start, and I know, so what I'd like to do for the next half hour or so, or a little bit longer, is to kind of channel we've done a lot of podcasts, we've done a lot of interviews, we've done a lot of book talks, and I want to take the opportunity to put Dean in the hot seat and just channel the moderators, channel the audiences that we've had, and ask the questions that I know are very typically on people's minds from that introduction. And so the first question I want to ask, sort of in some sense on behalf of the audience, is, I just put up this picture of what the global human future looks like, extending out, not just a couple of decades, but a couple of centuries or more. And a very natural and reasonable response is, well, how do you know that that's what the future looks like? So much can change. How do we know that that's where the world is heading? And so even though I put up the picture, I'm going to make you answer that question.
Okay, great. So I want to start by clarifying what we're saying and what we're not saying. What we're saying is that right now it looks like long-term global depopulation for longer than decades, for centuries or longer, looks like the most likely future, right? That's not the same thing as saying that it's certain to happen, right? We're not saying that it's certain to happen, but there is one thing that we're certain about, and that's this if-then relationship. If the total fertility rate for the world as a whole falls below an average of 2 children per 2 adults, and if it stays there for a long time, then there's no other possibility than long-term global depopulation. If one cohort is smaller than the cohort before and the next cohort is smaller than that one, that just is depopulation. And the only place people come from, there's no migration on and off the earth, is births, right? And so one day, death rates have been falling, birth rates have been falling. So far, the number of deaths each year has been less than the number of births, and that's the one and only reason why the size of the world population has been growing, but that won't always be the case. And if the number of people born keeps falling, then eventually those numbers will meet. And so, when we talk about how do we know that there's going to be a change, one thing that happened without us even noticing it is that there already was a change. We already passed the year 2012, which was the year of peak births, peak babies. In 2012, there were 146 million births around the world, and that was more than in any year before it. But it was also more than in any year since, and possibly more than any year in the future. So I guess what I'm saying is it's not science fiction or speculation of any kind, but rather history, that we've already passed the year of peak births, which means that right now we're between two peaks. We're between the year of peak births and the year of peak population size. And it's just because this is still working its way through the system that the size of the population is still growing. And so what I'm really saying is that if, or even more than that, if birth rates, the total fertility rate for the world as a whole, goes below 2, and stays there, then there's nothing else that could happen other than long-term depopulation. So I've partially answered the question, which is that one part of it is an if-then statement, which we are certain about. But okay, then to say that global depopulation is the most likely future, we have to believe that a low birth rate, a low global average total fertility rate is a likely thing to think that's going to happen. Now, I want to be very clear that if the total fertility rate for the world as a whole is 1.6 like it is in the United States today, or 1.8 like in Latin America or Texas, or 1.5 like in Europe, or any number below 2, it wouldn't ever have to fall 1 inch below that ever again for global depopulation to happen cohort after cohort, generation after generation. A perfectly stable long-term total fertility rate at some number below 2 would be enough for depopulation to happen. So to be very clear, we're not saying that we believe that the total fertility rate is going to continue to fall forever, because we don't have to say that. That's just not part of the logic here. All we're saying is that it looks likely that it's going to fall below 2 and stay there. And if that's surprising, this is something that Mike sort of got at. You should notice that a world with a total fertility rate kind of like 1.8, like it is in Latin America or Texas, isn't that different to live in than a world with a total fertility rate kind of like 2.1 or kind of like 2.2, right? You're not going to notice the difference going to the park or going to the grocery store. It just turns out to have a big difference for a population of humans where we come in twos like that. Okay,
but let's get into the evidence.
Okay.
So the evidence about why anyone would think it's reasonable or likely or more likely than not that we're heading towards a future in which birth rates stay low. I think one thing that has already come up, you sort of nodded to it, Pat in her introduction sort of nodded to it, but one of the reasons, just to lay this out, is that for as long as we've had good data on birth rates around the world, birth rates have been falling. So it wasn't an increase in fertility that drove humanity's numbers into the billions. It was a decrease in deaths, and particularly children's deaths. That's the only reason that the population spiked. And so part of the answer for why you might think that we're heading towards a long-term low fertility future is that it's a path we've been on for literally hundreds of years. Fertility has been falling. That's not to say in every year, in every country, fertility only goes down. We had a global mid-century baby boom, but before the baby boom, fertility rates were falling. After the baby boom, fertility rates kept falling. The baby boom, in historical sense, was a blip. It was temporary, and then it was over. And so one of the reasons to think that this future is likely is to recognize what has happened in the past, and what hasn't happened. So what are the other reasons, though, Dean, from our research, from your research, that make you think that long-term low fertility is a likely enough future to take seriously?
Great. So I think that the most important reason to think this is just how broadly shared this decline in fertility rates has been. So you said we have seen long-term low birth rates, and I want to talk for a second about who we is, because it's common these days when you see newspaper articles or something, especially in the United States, it's something like the fall in birth rates in the United States since the Great Recession or something like that. And that's making it out to be a very small and a very recent story, something happening in the United States, something happening over the past few years. And I get it, US news media is for the US, but the thing is, the fall in fertility rates has been not only enormous over time, like Mike was saying, wherever we have records over the long run, we see that birth rates have been falling. It's also very broadly shared across space. We think of below replacement fertility rates as something that's true of the richest countries, maybe. And that's because the first countries to fall below 2 were your classic advanced industrial democracies. So in the 1970s, Japan, Canada, Europe, Australia, these were places where it was falling below 2. And so by 1980, it was already the case that 20% of people lived in a country with the total fertility rate below 2. But it's not just those sorts of places anymore. Two-thirds of people around the world live in a country with a total fertility rate below 2. Now, I study India. My research is about, not just India overall, but really a pretty disadvantaged part of India in the north, a state called Uttar Pradesh, where 200 million people live. And Uttar Pradesh, which is one of the most disadvantaged places anywhere, right now has a total fertility rate of 2.3. India as a whole is at 2. And young women, teenagers in Uttar Pradesh, they say that they want an average of 1.9 children. So a world where young women in Uttar Pradesh are having and wanting below 2 children is a world where a lot of people are having below 2 children. So the first reason Mike gave is that this isn't just a flash in the pan, falling birth rates. It's something that we've seen over a long period of time. It's also something that we see in many different places, including places that are dissimilar to one another, right? Society, economics, policy, culture, these are all different in Japan versus the United States versus Uttar Pradesh versus Australia versus Northern Europe. And yet we see in all of these places birth rates falling. Even Sub-Saharan Africa, the only major world region with a birth rate still above 2, is a place where it's falling. It's now around an average of 4.3, which means down from 5 a couple decades ago and down from 6 a couple decades before that. And there's a lot of room for human development left in Sub-Saharan Africa. Literacy rates are low, especially female literacy rates are low. So there's every reason to think that as that human development continues, fertility rates are going to fall there too. And so why do we think this is a likely future? Not a certain future, but a likely future, because it's something that we see in so many sufficiently dissimilar places around the world to suggest that there are lots of different types of headwinds against having more children. And so it's a convergent outcome in many places.
So I also know that usually this is the point in a talk where the question on people's minds is, well, why is fertility low?
Yeah. Well, anything that is that broadly shared across that many places and that many times, there's not going to be one simple answer for, right? There's not going to be one silver bullet explanation that fits all. So one story that you sometimes hear people talking about in the United States is about affordability. Oh, I can't afford to have more children. But, there are so many places, for one, I think we can challenge the evidence about that even for the United States, but there are so many places where affordability looks very different, and we still see fertility rates falling. Places where college or university is highly subsidized, places where the state does more, or places like India where economic growth has been pretty rapid recently. So we look at places where we would see a different picture for affordability, and we still see birth rates falling. You hear people say that maybe the problem is the decline in religion, or the problem they would say is the decline in religiosity, or people, and that's why we see falling fertility. But that it's easy to find counterexamples to that too. Latin America, 90% of people tell a Pew survey that they consider themselves Christian, and yet the total fertility rate is 1.8. In India, almost everybody has religion having some role in their lives. It's a strong force in society, and we see birth rates there falling below 2. We hear stories about, people would say maybe the problem is, the gender revolution or feminism or women in the workforce, and somebody might say we need to roll back progress towards gender equity. But it's hard to, that doesn't seem to fit the evidence either. I mean, South Korea is hardly anyone's example of a gender equal society. It's got the widest gender wage gap of any OECD country, and it's got the lowest birth rate of all. And here again, I think India is a really impressive example or forceful example, in that India is a country where the female labor force participation rate is really low in international comparison. It's 40%. And on top of that, people continue, marriage remains almost universal in India. It happens at young ages. People start having children at young ages, and they just, in statistical average, have one or two, and then, stop having children, often with permanent contraception surgery. So, point being, that doesn't fit any of the stories we hear from a place like the United States, where people talk about family and career challenges or delaying childbearing, which could be very important here and a very big part of the story, but they're not the story everywhere. Now, why am I belaboring all those details about different countries being different? You kind of knew that, but because if what we're seeing is something that's happening in different unalike places in different unalike ways, but still a very convergent outcome, that's really suggestive to us that it's likely to be a robust phenomenon that's likely to continue.
Yeah, so I wanted to start talking about, the book is called The Case for People, but I think for many of us, we've heard a case against people for a long time. It's sort of the waters we swim in. In many circles, it's sort of taken for granted that, because humans cause environmental harm, and no one here is disagreeing with that basic premise. Humans cause environmental harm. So wouldn't it be the case that a smaller human population would be an environmental boon? Wouldn't this, in some ways, rescue us from the environmental challenges that we're facing? Wouldn't this be a benefit from the perspective of especially climate change? And so I want to talk about the environment, and I'm going to put it again to you. Why isn't it the case? Because I know that you and I think that it's not the case, but why isn't it the case that a declining global population is going to be an important part of what is going to help us address climate change?
Okay. So I want to start out by being clear what question I'm answering. Because, I'll see why I'm saying that. Because, of course, we face enormous environmental challenges. Of course, humans cause them. Right? Of course, people pollute. Of course, humanity has caused climate change. And, of course, if all along for the past decades and centuries, there hadn't been so many billions of us, there wouldn't be so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere for a variety of reasons, and we wouldn't be facing the same challenges that we do now. Now, I'm not saying, anything more than just that, but of course all of that is true, right? Now, but we don't today have any sort of lever to go back and change the fertility rate or the size of the human population, in 1925, right? The question that we face today is, what do we do now with the climate challenges that we face now? And the two fundamental facts about today's climate challenge is that they are important and that they are urgent. So, let's go back to the graph that Mike showed at the beginning about the likely path of the future population. And the scale was denominated in, thousands of years, but our climate challenge, our time scale that we need to decarbonize, is not denominated in thousands of years. The time scale in which we need to decarbonize is denominated in years to decades, right? The UN projects that the peak in the size of the world population, the year when the number of births equals the number of deaths and our numbers turn around, will come about 6 decades from now. The particular year they say is 2084. Of course nobody knows if it's actually 2084, and other groups of demographers put it even sooner than that, but it's as good a reckoning as any other. So let's say 6 decades from now in 2084, right? 6 decades from now in 2084, To wait for global depopulation to get us off the hook for our environmental challenges is radically, radically too late for the time scale that we need to decarbonize. I mean, if you have a kid or don't today, they're going to be deciding whether to have a kid or not, 30 years from now or 25 years from now. And 30 or 25 years from now is in the 2050s, which is, the time by which, or well past the time by which, we need to have substantially decarbonized. And so, point being, yes, this is all going to happen fast on the level of generations. Like, yes, the graph that Mike showed about 10 to 55, or 100 to 75 to 55 is fast on the level of generations. But the level of generations isn't the time scale that we're talking about for our climate challenge. Relative to our climate challenges, the size of the human population is just too big of a ship, too slowly turning. And so nothing that could feasibly happen over the coming years or decades to change the birth rates, the flow into and out of the population, is going to change the stock of our numbers fast enough to be the urgent response that we need to our climate challenges. So for climate change in particular, there's just no alternative to reducing our per person emissions, to decarbonizing per person, and to accelerating the day when there aren't carbon emissions per person, so an extra person doesn't cause carbon emissions per person. And so for the climate challenge, even though humans have caused them, and even though if we were having this conversation 50 or 75 years ago, we'd be giving a different answer, having the conversation today with the stock of the population we've got, and with the stock of atmospheric carbon dioxide that we've got, they're two different challenges. What the population of the world as a whole does after 2084, after 2100, is just a separate question from how we're going to decarbonize in the very coming years to near-term decades.
Yeah, that's right. And obviously climate isn't the only environmental challenge that we face. And in the book we talk about other forms of environmental challenge, air pollution, for example. But we also look back in time at other forms of environmental challenges that we've actually faced pretty successfully. The trouble with an environmental challenge that you've already faced successfully and faced down and sort of beat back is that no one thinks it was ever a challenge, right? Decades ago, we had a problem with CFCs burning a hole through the stratospheric ozone layer, right? We implemented policy treaty, the Montreal Protocol, that reduced CFCs. It's not a problem in the same way anymore. We had a problem with sulfur dioxide emission causing acid rain in the United States, but the Clean Air Act, amendments to it since in the 1990s and forward, meant that we don't face that environmental challenge anymore. And the thing that these successes have in common, and which I think will be shared by any successful response that we mount against greenhouse gas emissions, is that they've reduced the harm per person. There's really sort of no other way to take on environmental challenges on any sort of timescale that is equal to the task, equal to the seriousness of the challenges that we face, other than reducing the per person harms. That's what we did with sulfur dioxide emissions. That's what we did in every case where we've had successes in the past. And I don't know how much we're going to, the pace at which we're going to succeed or fail when it comes to reducing per capita greenhouse gas emissions, but that really is where all the action is going to be going forward in terms of the degree of success or failure that we have on climate.
I just wanted, I'm going to rudely insert myself here and just put a little bit...
You have a microphone in front of you, it's okay.
Put a little bit more sharpness on that, because in the introduction I just mentioned that I spend a lot of time in India, and that's a place where a really in front of your nose environmental challenge is particulate air pollution. It's sometimes called PM 2.5 after the measurement of the size of the particles, and it is just awful, especially this time of year in a place like Uttar Pradesh. You hear about it in Delhi, but all along those northern plains. But here's the thing: you used to hear about that all the time in Mexico City. You used to hear about that all the time about Beijing and Chinese cities. In fact, in 2013, it was China and Beijing that was making international news for what was called the airpocalypse. And in the airpocalypse in Beijing, they shut down the U.S. embassy, and foreign missions, sent everyone's families homes as hardship postings, and it was literally off the scales of these particle counter readers. Something like 700 on a scale of 0 to 500. The things that counted the particles would get clogged with too many of the particles, and it was terrible for people's health, right? This sort of particular, so the environmental writer David Wallace Wells had a big piece talking about how this kills more people than climate change, not just now, but over a foreseeable, medium-term future. Particle air pollution kills people, it stunts the growth of children, it causes older adult mortality. I'm belaboring it, but it really is a very big deal. So that was 2013, the apocalypse in China. And what happened over the 10 years after that? Well, one thing that happened over the 10 years after that is that the size of the Chinese population grew by 50 million people. 50 million people is a lot. It's, bigger than many European countries. It's 1.5 Texases, right?
It's bigger than Canada.
Yeah, and so if more people always meant more environmental harm, then you would have expected particle air pollution in China to have gotten much worse over that decade. But in fact, particle air pollution in China fell by half. And over that same, it's not just China, over that same decade, particle air pollution in the world fell also, even as the world added 750 million people. Now, it didn't happen everywhere. I've already told you that it hasn't improved like that in India. And that gives us a hint, right? The policymakers and the government in India haven't made the choices to reduce particle pollution and confront it and tackle it and be honest about it in the way that has happened in places like China or places like Mexico City. In China, they regulated industry, they shut down coal plants, they required industry to use technology, not necessarily new technology, but closer to the frontier. They regulated vehicles, maybe that's a smaller part of it, but they made different choices. The humans who were doing humans environmentally destructive activity did different things. And my point being, particle air pollution in China and so many other places got better even as the size of the population grew larger, which is what has always happened whenever we've made progress against an environmental challenge, which we haven't done enough of, but we have done stuff of. Whenever we've made progress against an environmental challenge, it's always been while the population was growing, because the population always has been growing. And so the lesson of this about China is, if we change what people do, not that it's going to happen automatically, but we got to do it. If we change what people do, then we can reduce the per person environmental impact, and that's the way forward. Not to be distracted by the size of the human population, which anyway is going to be growing for the next 6 decades.
Yeah, I want to just hold there on this idea of the population growing. We had an introduction, we talked about a future of population decline. We're talking about a near term of continued population growth and exactly one instant of zero population growth before the sign flips to negative. And I'm realizing it'd be hard from this conversation so far to actually even have a sense of what we're advocating for in the book, which is a global population that someday stabilizes. Possibly stabilizing at a level like today's, possibly stabilizing at a level lower than today's. But that there's this sort of fundamental, inescapable truth that if what you hope for is a global population that doesn't decline generation after generation after generation, even a tiny global population, even a global population of 4 billion people, 2 billion people, 1 billion people, then to activate that hope, for that to work out, what would need to happen is that birth rates would still have to rise. Birth rates would have to rise to 2 kids per 2 adults, because at a level lower than that, the population would just keep shrinking. So even folks who have a deeply held belief or intuition that a much smaller population would be better, in some sense, are on the same page, because what that would mean is that birth rates would someday have to rise. That's sort of an inescapable reality. But talking about
And
birth
there's
rates.
one level beyond that. Just notice what's implied there. It's not the case that the only two possibilities for the human future are depopulation forever and population growth forever. There's a third possibility, which is rough stabilization somewhere in the middle. And I guess if you only remember one thing from what we're saying tonight, to remember that as a possible future that, I don't literally mean the same number of people every year, but rough stabilization as a future that we could imagine choosing to work towards.
Yeah, but I don't want to back away from the reality that it would mean birth rates rising, and I think that immediately for so many of us, you think about what is this time frame that it's been very salient that birth rates have been falling. It's since the baby boom generation, thinking about the latter half of the 20th century and now the beginning of the 21st century, this has been a period of rapid economic, social, political progress for women. And I think there's a latent fear, which is completely understandable and makes sense, that at some level, if you're talking about birth rates rising, then isn't that somehow implying some sort of rollback of that progress, that incomplete, but that progress in social, political, economic life, that women, not just in the United States, but around the world, have experienced over the past half century or so. And I'm going to give you that question.
Okay, so, it does make a lot of sense. And I think one of the reasons that it makes sense to be asking this question is because a lot of the people who are out there talking about low fertility rates or depopulation are people in the political space, especially in the United States, who are also talking about wanting to roll back progress towards gender equity, wanting to go back to a time where women weren't as welcome in the public space or in workspaces. And frankly, I think we need to not notice the fact that those folks were probably wanting and advocating that even before they were talking about fertility rates.
Sure, whatever the problem is, that's the solution.
Exactly, for that group of people. And so we need to reject that for that reason, even if we're not having a conversation about fertility rates. But nevertheless, let's not stop there, because if we did think that the only way we could reach a stabilized future rather than depopulation was to make parenting and life less fair, then that would be an important stopping point in this conversation. Parenting has been unfair in every society that's ever existed, and frankly, every society that's ever existed has been unfair even when parenting isn't involved. And so we do need to have this conversation. But there's something unserious, to my mind, about thinking that making things less fair rather than more fair, loading the burden of parenting even further onto some of us, is what's going to cause more people to choose to have children. I mean, for starters, let me say the only thing that we're advocating in After the Spike is a future where we one day work towards a stabilized population where more people who want to feel like they're supported and can choose to have children in a way that works out to an average fertility rate of 2. And there's no contradiction there between choice and a stabilized population. I mean, for starters, having a child is a free choice, contraception is available, and abortion is legal in France and in South Korea, right? But the birth rate in France is more than twice what it is in South Korea because society is different in other ways there too. So yes, to access to reproductive health care and reproductive freedom, yes to people becoming a parent if and only if they want to, but no, that doesn't settle every question about what society is to build. There's still work to be done in making society fairer in other ways too. I think for too long, we've had this idea that, or at least many people have the idea, men have the idea, I should say directly, that babies are somebody else's problem, right? There are those of us who do care work and those of us who do important work, and it's not the same people. And if you're one of the important work people, then it's not your job to worry about care work. And I think one of the lessons that one of the things we're trying to say in After the Spike is that we all have a stake in one another, that other people are win-win and we all have a stake in the next generation. That means we need to start by getting over this idea that making the next generation is just the work of some of us. Because I mean, to go back to the idea that rolling progress backwards, or that unfreedom or inequality is the way to raise birth rates. I mean, just think about it for a second. Why is the birth rate in South Korea the place with the most unfair and unequal gender wage gap, the lowest of any OECD countries? Well, if you're putting all of the burden on, on some of the people, on women, on mothers, then of course they're going to look at that and say, no, thank you, right? If we want to construct a future where parenting feels like a more attractive option, and people feel like they're able to choose it, then there's no way forward other than to make parenting better and make parenting fairer. And so rolling back progress towards equity is no way to do it. Instead, we've got to continue the progress towards a fairer future, and one in which more people feel like they're supported and have the opportunities to, if they want to, choose parenting alongside aspiring to other good things for their lives.
Okay, so one of the things that you said in there is that other people are win-win, that we're all, you're sort of gesturing at the idea that in some sense, we all benefit from living in a big world. We all have benefited from living in a big world, and we should be sharing the burden of creating the next generation more equally. But neither of us actually said much about why we think that other people are win-win. Even if you grant the premise that depopulation is the most likely future, even if you grant the premise, and I wouldn't expect to fully grant this premise based on a 10-minute conversation about population and the environment, but even if you were to grant that a declining population isn't going to rescue us from taking our commitments to environmental stewardship more seriously and more head-on, even if you think that birth rates raising back up to something closer to 2 than the 1.6 in the United States, for example, even if that wouldn't mean rolling back progress on gender equity, even if you believe all of those things, nothing you said yet has made an affirmative case for people. And so there's 1/4 of our book is making the affirmative case for people. Give us the affirmative case for people, or give us one piece of the affirmative case for people.
Okay, so I want to go back to that phrase win-win, right? We're used to thinking of other people as a problem, as something that gets in our way, as somebody who's eating our slice of the pie, and we're really trying to reorient that, to get people to think of other people as win-win. And what do I mean by win-win? I mean that their lives are good for them and their lives are good for you. And I want to start on what may sound like the weirdest part of that, which is their lives are good for them. This is, in other words, we think that there's something good about people getting to live good lives, and that something would be lost in a depopulating future relative to a stabilized future, that there would just be less of the stuff of good lives lived. The way we say it in the book is that more good is better, and so less goodness, including from less people getting to whatever it is you like, whether that's your morning cup of coffee, whether it's reading a book, whether a walk along the lake, whatever it is for you, there's good stuff there, and there's going to be less of that, less bowling, less birthday parties, less whatever in a depopulating future, and yes, we're giving our perspective, but I don't want to create the impression that we're merely giving our perspective. There's, a literature at the intersection of economics and philosophy called population ethics, which has considered this question deeply. Sort of considered the question that we kind of want to ignore, which is, where it's easy to ask which policy would be better in a future where Abe, B, Murrow, and Chin are the three people who are going to be alive either way. You think, oh, okay, I want to make Abe, B, Murrow, and Chin better off. Maybe on average. Maybe I care about inequality. Maybe I care especially about the worst off, something like that. It's a lot harder when under one future Daniela will live, and on the other future she'll never exist in the first place. How do you value that? And that sort of, for a long time, that sort of question flummoxed economists and philosophers. But there's been progress on that, and and one of the things that we're calling for is to, people to think about that question and talk about that question and see if it sounds right to you that more good is better, that something is lost, that there isn't as much good life being lived. Now, I know that if you were allowed to raise your hand right now and you're in the United States, as opposed to in a country where reproductive freedom and health care is settled law and not contentious in the same way it is here, then you're saying, doesn't this just sound like an anti-abortion argument? And no, it doesn't, because we're not saying anything about coercing people. And to be very clear what I mean by that, saying that something is valuable or might be valuable, under some circumstances might have a value to be considered, is not the same thing as saying that anyone should or must do it, or the state should force them to do it, or that it shouldn't be people's free choice. I think, we talked about at the beginning of my work in India with, neonatal life-saving program with, nurses who work in it. There aren't enough nurses who do that sort of work. And we could prevent more deaths in Uttar Pradesh if there were more nurses who were trained and excited to do that sort of work. That would make the world a better place, and there'd be more good in it if that happened.
And more life.
And more life. But that doesn't mean that I think that the state should compel people to do it, or that we should send the police to round people up and make them be nurses. More goodness and more life is created when somebody voluntarily and altruistically chooses to be a kidney donor. We can all recognize that that's true and that that's good, and still believe that people should have the absolute freedom to choose what to do with their own bodies in that way. There's just no contradiction in saying that kidney donations can cause good, and that the state shouldn't force people to do them, and that you should still be free to choose. And so no, that's not what I'm saying here, and it's not a counter-argument against recognizing that one part of other people's lives being win-win is the good for them part. But I didn't really answer what you probably expected me to, which is the other people's lives are good for you.
So let's go there. So imagine that you have failed to convince everybody here that other people's lives are good for them in a way that matters, and that are good for themselves in a way that matters. What if all you cared about was the average quality of life among people who come to exist? What if the question is, how well off is the average person in a future with a larger population versus a smaller population? How do we think about that? What tools has economic history given us? What tools has the study of macroeconomic growth given us? How can you make sense of the claim that we make in the book that we're actually lucky to get to live at a time when there's many other people living on the planet next to us? Why is it that we're lucky to get to live at a time when many other people have come just before us?
Okay, so I want to be clear what I'm saying here, which is not that, if I were some sort of finance minister trying to promote economic growth, the number one best and most efficient way to do this would be to cause there to be more babies, because that's just obviously false. I mean, for starters, babies are mooches and spend several decades not being economically productive in any way. And so I think there's a different and more specific claim here, which is that over the long run, if we go towards a sort of stabilized population future rather than a long-term depopulation future, which you might mainly think is a good idea for other reasons other than the economy, but over the long run, if we go towards a stabilized future rather than a depopulated future, which is the sort of question that we have to confront, then it's good to know that living standards would be higher in the stabilized future than in the depopulating future. We'd make more progress towards reducing poverty, better lives, curing diseases, higher living standards, cool stuff to experience in the stabilized future than in the depopulating future. Now, why is that? We're sort of used to think of other people as our competition, that if there are more other people, then they get the thing, then I can't have it. And so there are two reasons that we talk about in the book for why other people are good for us economically. The first reason has to do with long-term economic progress. Like, fundamentally, why are our lives here today with these amazing microphone systems and modern healthcare and indoor climate control, so it's not 29 degrees inside and all that,
and no fear that next season, depending on the harvest, we're not going to have enough to eat.
Right. Why are our lives so much better, longer, richer, healthier than the lives of people a few hundred years ago? It's not supposed to be a trick question. It's fairly obvious. Like, it's the same sun and wind overhead and the same rocks beneath us, but we know more and better what to do with them. We know more what to do with those resources. We have technology, we have knowledge that they didn't have. So knowledge and technology is a special type of economic resource. When we think about population economics, our minds fairly quickly go to the idea of depletable resources and other people using stuff up. But knowledge, ideas, technology, know-how, these are a special type of economic resource that don't get used up when they get used. And so if there's a sick kid here and we treat her with an antibiotic pill, that pill is gone. No one will ever take that particular pill again. It's over. So it's a depleted resource. But the recipe of that pill, the formula for how to make it, and even more important, the science behind it, the hard science of the chemical compound and the soft science of how to organize a nursing team to get the pill in the mouth, those are all knowledge that exists completely undepleted and ready to go for the next person to use on the next sick kid, or maybe even we know it a little bit better than we did before because of the experience of using it. And so this is the big idea behind the Nobel Prize that the macroeconomist Paul Romer won in 2018. That knowledge, ideas, know-how, recipes, these are what's called a non-rival resource in economics. A non-rival is economist term for it doesn't get used up when you use it. And so more people using organic chemistry or pre-algebra or the language French doesn't cause it to get used up or depleted and not be there for the next person. And that's a fundamental engine of long-term economic progress and growth. And so not only would more people not use up our ideas, they would help us find it. And I don't, sometimes this idea get, like when we say this to journalists, they write it down as, what these guys are saying is that we need more people so that we have more like draws out of the urn of maybe we're going to get a genius like Marie Curie or something. And that's not what we're saying at all. We're not talking about the rare geniuses or even people at work in professional R&D. Yes, that happens and that's important, that's part of it. But every time anybody is doing something useful, organizing a kindergarten classroom, organizing an event like this, you'll learn something by doing it. And that knowledge exists for the next people to use. So I said there are two economic reasons. One of them is this idea that knowledge is an undepletable or non-depleting resource that comes from other people. Should I give the other reason?
Quickly. Yeah, we want to make sure we have lots of time for people to ask questions.
Okay.
But give it quickly.
So the other reason has to do with the scale effects from the economics of fixed costs. And to say it in one sentence, other people needing and wanting what you need and want makes it more likely for you to get it. Because other people needing and wanting what you need and want makes it more likely that it's going to make economic sense and feasibility for the thing to happen. That's really straightforward when you think of certain type of businesses. Like we live in Austin, and so I like to think of like, where are you going to be able to get lunch at a taco truck? Where's the taco truck going to go? It's going to go where it thinks there's going to be customers. Because if it goes to one place, it's sort of it's giving up on the opportunity of going somewhere else, or just not existing at all, right? So you need other people to want the lunch that you want in order to get it. But it's, of course applies to things more important than lunch, like, medical treatments. Like if you have a rare disease that few people have ever had before, then there might not be a treatment for it. We don't want other people to be sick, of course, but more people having had the same need for the same treatment as you have means, or as your loved one has, means there's more likely to be a cure for it. And we see that in the economics literature on what firms invest in developing cures for. They invest in the things where they think there's going to be a big chunk of the population that's going to need it. So a future where there are more other people is a future where more projects are going to be feasible, not just commercial projects, but we were talking at dinner about schools closing down because there aren't enough kids for them. And then there are fewer programs, less enrichment, people having to drive further. There's going to be less media produced, less movies, less radio, whatever it is you like. Other people paying the fixed costs or being part of the economic rationale or even feasibility of it existing, whether a government program, a media program, a business, a restaurant, a hospital makes it possible for it to exist, so it's there for you too. And so a depopulating future is going to be one where there are fewer other people needing and wanting what you need and want, and that's worse for you too.
So I was going to ask about what we know about the tools available to governments, to societies that could plausibly change course. I'm not going to ask that question, instead I'm just going to give the answer very briefly myself. And to really cut to the chase, although low fertility has been, even though it's a relatively new point of attention in the United States political landscape, low fertility has been prevalent in other countries around the world for a half century or more. And so we know from the experience of these countries the success that they've had when they've tried to take steps to reverse low fertility. And I think Dean hinted at this a bit at the beginning in talking about affordability, how a lot of us hear, for us, we hear our friends, sometimes we hear our students or younger cohorts talking about affordability as a barrier to having children. If the affordability constraint could just be lifted or slackened a little bit, that they believe they would choose more children. I think, unfortunately, the long history of the world, where the world has got richer and richer and richer every decade, not just for people living the high life in America and other rich developed countries, but people have gotten less poor and less poor and less poor in other parts of the world. When you look across richer and poorer places, none of that should give anyone confidence that if people just had a bit more money, if childcare was just a bit more affordable, if college tuition was a bit more affordable, if healthcare was a bit more affordable, if housing was a bit more affordable, that birth rates would rise. The evidence is pretty clear that would not cause birth rates to rise, at least not to the level that would bring levels that are common today, 1.4, 1.5, 1.6, 1.8, back up to replacement levels. And maybe in the Q&A, feel free to interrogate that. There's a lot of economic evidence on this, but I think you can intuit this by looking around the world. Where are birth rates highest? It's not in the places that are richest. Where are the families historically that have the largest families? Not the richest families. Right? It's actually pretty flat across the US income distribution. Not perfectly flat, but not an important difference in income. So if it's not affordability, if that's not a way to turn this around, what are the tools? And I'm just going to short circuit this answer and say nobody, and I don't just mean Dean and I don't have an answer. I mean that not researchers, not policymakers, not politicians, not governments that have tried things, free daycare or heavily subsidized daycare, paid parental leave, free college tuition, free healthcare for children, and in limited experiments, universal basic income. These are not things that have turned around low fertility. And so where we are right now is that nobody knows, even if they wanted to turn low fertility around, what to do about that. And so I want to make the last question here before we open up to audience questions. If we're in this place where nobody yet knows what to do about low fertility, why are we even having this conversation if it's sort of hopeless?
Well, I don't think it is hopeless. I wouldn't have written the book and I wouldn't be here talking about it if I thought it was hopeless. I mean, I want to say that one answer is that it's kind of okay that we don't know what to do yet, because we're pretty far from, as we said at the beginning with raising hands, from a consensus that a stabilized future would be better than a future of depopulation. Frankly, we're pretty far from people knowing that people in general knowing that depopulation is a likely future. And, in a democratic society, we want policy making to be something that reflects that sort of consensus. And so anyone saying, pass my piece of legislation right now, that's clearly too soon, not just because we don't know what to do, but for the more fundamental reason that there's not a consensus that that's the future that society should. That's what Mike and I believe, and we believe that we should all be working towards a future where parenting is more supported and fairer, and we do more to share that burden, and that building a consensus that a stabilized population in the future someday would be better than depopulation. We're not there yet as a society. And so, if you're saying, what to do next, we, for starters, hope that you'll read the book. There's a lot more in the book and more evidence and more thought than we can talk about here. And I'm not saying buy it. Feel free to get it from the library or steal it. Please do take a look at the book and have a conversation with somebody. Ask them if what future they think is likely. Ask them if they think other people are win-win. If they think it's good, it's something's lost when a life isn't lived, if it's bad for them. But on the question of hopeless, here I talked a lot about timing and climate change earlier, and I want to talk about timing and climate change in another way here, for why, even though there's so much that I know that I don't know what to do and nobody else knows what to do, I think there's reason not to think it's hopeless, to be optimistic, and that's to think about if the size of the human population is going to peak and depopulation is going to start 6 decades from now. What was climate policy like 6 decades ago? And 6 decades ago, humanity knew some basic things about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and radiative forcing. Svante Arrhenius had done the basic computation, which turned out to be basically right, but it wasn't something that we broadly knew about. 6 decades ago, the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii had just started to record carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and President Johnson gave one of the first speeches that called it a policy problem, in a speech that listed other pollutants too. 6 decades ago, we were just getting started on climate policy and climate science, and if somebody had gone to a forum like this 6 decades ago and said, because of our climate challenges, what we need to do right now is immediately get rid of the internal combustion engine, they would have, been laughed off the stage. It would have been a silly thing to say, and it would have been wrong, right, at that time. But what we did need to do was start learning, start the social movement, start the political movement, start the research, start the academic movement. So today we have, departments of sustainability. We have the journal Nature Climate Change. We have that geography classroom where Mike presented. We have all of this that we know now that we didn't know then. We have cheap solar energy, cheap batteries, cheap wind, and we have so many more options and feasibility than before because people were working on it all along, even when nobody knew what to do. And now getting rid of the internal combustion engine doesn't seem like such a crazy possibility after all. And so I don't think it's hopeless, because I'm optimistic that future people will better understand this than we do now. And if we get started on the same sort of project of learning and talking, then we might build some of that consensus and build some of that knowledge and, come to better ideas and better possibilities. And isn't it great, I'll let this be my last sentence, that the people who first were thinking about climate change as a policy challenge 6 decades ago didn't give up back then because it seemed too far in the future or too remote or too silly, or they didn't have all the answers.
All right, so now we want to open it up for questions.
So my question to you is, given the reality that people make pollution, why are you so excited at the thought of increasing the replacement?
So first of all, yes, people make pollution. I want to be clear though. I have a son that was born in 2013. When my son was born in 2013, his life, his existence, didn't cause there to be more chlorofluorocarbons in the atmosphere. His life didn't cause more lead to be pumped into the air. His life didn't cause more sulfur dioxide emissions. And the reason that his life contributed exactly 0 to each of those environmental problems is that we had policy that targeted the pollution. I understand the urge. It's almost like a karmic urge to think people have done all this harm. And so isn't it just fitting that the solution to this should be to have fewer of us? The problem is it's not actually any solution. It may feel right, but it's not actually a solution. If 50 years from now, the United States population is 200 million instead of 330 million, right? What our environmental landscape is going to look like depends so much more on what our policies are than what that number is, right? a shrinking population that spills out, that plays out over decades, is not going to be the thing that turns on new solar farms and new wind farms and builds those off of coasts. It's not going to be the thing that lays the transmission lines that move power across the country from where the sun is shining and the wind is blowing to where it's not. A declining population is not going to be the thing that invents a solution for low carbon concrete. Those things will need to happen, and either they'll happen or they won't, but pretty independently over the short run relative to population size. And so, just to hang on this idea of, I really think it's useful and instructive to look back and see how we've solved problems in the past and how we haven't solved problems in the past. In the late 1960s, there was a huge problem in the United States with lead in the air. People were breathing in lead. It was an environmental catastrophe for humans, but it was also an environmental catastrophe for other animals, for nature more broadly. Lead is a terrible neurotoxin. I think everyone kind of understands this now, and we understood it then, and it was a huge problem. Now, the way that we dealt with people, other fauna, breathing in, being exposed, being poisoned by lead, we could have said, it's almost too silly to say, but we could have said the way we're going to deal with lead in the air just to be clear, we were burning leaded gasoline that was being pumped into the air. We could have said the way we're going to deal with this is there's too many drivers that are driving leaded gasoline vehicles. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a big campaign and a big push to have fewer drivers, right? We're going to invest more in public transportation. So the buses are also going to burn leaded fuel, but we'll do it much more efficiently. There'll be fewer drivers on the road, right? Of course, that would have been a ludicrous way to address lead in gasoline. If you want to address lead in gasoline, you do what you do in 1970, you pass a Clean Air Act that takes lead out of gasoline. There is no other path to addressing the harms that people do on any time scale that is relevant other than addressing the harms. All right, it wouldn't have made sense to ask, hope for, try to work for a smaller number of drivers on the road if your problem is lead and gasoline. It doesn't make sense to hope for, work for, try to bring about fewer people on the planet if you're worried about particulate matter air pollution, if you're worried about plastic pollution, if you're worried about greenhouse gas emissions. Right? I think we can learn a lot from the history.
I'm hoping you can share some insights with us on how to approach the issue of carrying capacities. There might be, suppose there are 250 nations, there could be 250 carrying capacities, or there could be large groupings. Give us any insights into approaching that.
So I don't think that we're at a place in terms of population science, in terms of climate science, in terms of economic science, that anyone can give a very precise answer to. I think there's some sense in which maybe this isn't your question, but often we hear that question, sort of underneath it is like, what's the right number of people to have on a planet? Maybe that's what you meant. I think it's really beyond what anyone can say. And I think no matter what anyone says, the most likely future is that, and really the unavoidable future at this point, is that for the next few decades, the population around the world will grow, it'll peak, it'll begin shrinking. The question for the future is, does it ever stop shrinking? And, in some sense, it's good that is so far in the future before we think anything reasonable could actually change the trajectory, because no one has the answer yet about what the right size of the global population is. But we know that if you thought that the right size of the global population, if your pen and paper calculations came out that the right size, the carrying capacity of the planet is 2 billion people, then that's a future in which, in order to maintain that size, in order for there to be 2 billion people on the planet, birth rates would have to someday rise. So I really don't want to overclaim that Dean or I think anyone else could tell you with any sort of precision, even down to the nearest billion, what the carrying capacity of the Earth is, because that statement, in some sense, doesn't even stand alone. What are the things that you value? Is the thing that you want, how many people can the Earth support who are, eating everything that they want and living to an average, life expectancy of 80? What are the things that you value? And I think all that's is going to impact the answer of, what the, and for lack of a better term, the right size population is. We don't claim to have that answer.
I just want to add something which, is pretty close to what Mike said, just to like emphasize a little bit more because of, taking both of these questions together. If you're out there and you're convinced that what we need is to stabilize the size of the world population at some size meaningfully smaller than today's, right? Mike said 2 billion, maybe 3 billion, maybe 1.5 billion. I don't know, nobody knows, maybe you know. Right? But if you're out there convinced that we need to stabilize the size of the population at some number smaller than today's, then that is perfectly in agreement with what we're saying, which is that stabilization at some size, at some point, maybe you think the stabilization shouldn't start for 100 years from now, go up and over the peak, go down for a few decades, and then start to stabilize, right? That's compatible, that more or less is what we're saying, which is that would be preferable to depopulation generation after generation without any sort of stabilization ever. What we're saying is that someday, we should start now talking about whether and how someday we might want to stabilize our numbers, perhaps 100 years from now or more, perhaps at some size much smaller than today. And that might sound, why are we talking about something far off in the future? Well, because where else does change come from? Other than people reading and talking about books and getting together about this and asking about the long-term future. So if you're out there convinced that stabilization at some level smaller than today is the future we want, great. We think that's better than depopulation forever too.
You kind of answered some of my questions, but 60 years ago, we were talking about stabilization, but 60 years ago when the population was much further down on your chart than what you showed us, right? And who's to say, watching that head for the sky 200 years ago when it was hovering at that plateau, was that the right population? Was that the place where we should have stabilized? Or, is 10 billion, is 20 billion the number? Where do you start? And when you do start to stabilize, or you think that's important, without the policy that goes with what you were just discussing about people's health, about people being able to eat, about people not just surviving, but people thriving, without that policy, without government, we talk about economics, economic production, you're looking for economic productivity. That's in the hands of many fewer people than it was 200 years ago or 400 years ago. Now it's a small percentage of the globe that has that control. How do you advocate for this stabilization without that policy being in place?
Yeah, just to sort of give a version of the answer that we've given, I think there is space to talk about something as a broadly desirable future without being able, or a broadly undesirable future, without being able to precisely quantify it. The first people talking about the need to decarbonize couldn't have told you, and even now people who are working towards it might disagree on exactly what year decarbonization should happen, or exactly how fast the pace should be, or exactly what fraction of the carbon budget should go to Africa rather than to India, rather than to South America, rather than to the United States, right? We can all agree on, but even if we don't see eye to eye on those questions, we should see eye to eye on rapid decarbonization as essential, right? We might not all agree on exactly how many doctors are needed in Kenya, or how many teachers or how many nurses, but it would still be right to say that more would be better. And so I just want to reject the idea that without a precise quantification, we can't be talking about important forces.
If you have a microphone, feel free to ask a question.
Yes. This may sound a little off the wall, but did you consider when you were thinking about population, about war? We had 2 very large world wars in the 20th century, and they're not just in the United States and Europe, they're all over the world, war all the time. Is there some way you consider that?
Sure. So we're demographers. We are an economist, and our focus in thinking about these projections in the same way that it's true of the demographers who are making projections at places like the United Nations World Populations Prospects. We're focused on more normal course changes in birth rates, changes in age-specific mortality rates, which is not in any way to say that that any particular projection looking forward is guaranteed or is 95% certain. There's all sorts of things that can happen. We haven't, in our lives, being born in 1980, lived through a global world war. We did live through a global pandemic, right? And that had an important, there was an important mortality imprint of that, right? That was a huge change to the global population with all sorts of other ramifications. So these projections aren't, there's no sense in which it's ruling in or ruling out, any sort of event like a global pandemic or war. It is a sort of centerline projection in the absence of a huge event like that. And in the absence of a huge event like that, the thing that's going to dictate the size of the population going forward is really not about mortality rates, it's all about birth rates. That's what those projections are good for, being informative of. They're not sort of counting in or counting out other possibilities of big global events.
Thank you for such a thought-provoking discussion. I have two questions. One is, what are some of the factors at 2012 that led to this transition from increase to decrease? Have you looked at that? And also, separate question related to sort of this supportive environment for women who want to have children. You mentioned Korea versus France. What are some of the factors that you think would sort of constitute this supportive environments?
Yeah, so let me answer the second part of the question first. When you talk with researchers who are South Korean, who study South Korea, I'm not an expert on South Korea, I really need to give that caveat, but when I talk with other economists and demographers from there, you hear the view that there's just this sort of double burden on women in South Korea where, if you want to have a career and you want to have children, you need to be doing the career 100%, you need to be doing the children 100%, more so than these folks would say is true in even the United States or certainly Europe. And so, I think that sort of inequality and that sort of that double burden is the sort of thing that we hear for South Korea in particular.
I was talking about generally.
Yeah, generally, we really meant it when we say that, we don't know what would cause birth rates to rise. And in part, that's saying we don't know exactly what that future of parenting would look like and how the present differs from that potential future in which, we're dads, we know that having children is joyful and also is sometimes a burden, right? It's both of those things at once, or sometimes at once and sometimes in different moments of the day. And we believe that a future that shares those, not just the joys, but the burdens more generally, and not just from mothers to fathers, but from parents and non-parents to people at different ages who aren't parenting young kids right now, might be a way towards a future in which people feel like they can combine more of what they want out of life, whether that's friendships outside of the family, whether that's education, career, just other goals for life, build those into a good life while also having children and feeling like all of that is attainable, all of that's something that they can aspire to. Not everybody, an average of 2 kids for the world overall doesn't mean everybody's having kids. It certainly doesn't mean everybody's having 2 kids. But for things to average out in that way, something has to change. And we really are serious when we say that we don't and nobody knows yet what that is. But we have a long future ahead of us, and we think that we should be investing now in figuring that out, learning what we can.
I just want to add a sentence to that, which is that sometimes people misunderstand us, and at this point they say, well, aha, in Northern Europe or Scandinavia, everything's all very equal, and yet birth rates are low, right? Well, I have I have co-authors who live in Sweden, and they tell me that actually it's not all that equal, and it's still very challenging to be a parent. And I don't think anyone has it all figured out. But I also think this isn't exactly an aha, because I think those of us who are alive today, could do everything to make parenting fairer and better supported, and we might still see the next generation of children not go on to have more kids, because they're growing up in the world as it is, and they're seeing and hearing from people who are facing these challenges and facing these unfairnesses, and forming their ideas of what's reasonable to aspire to and what might be possible in the world that we're in. And so even massive changes to the policy environment and social environment might not change what they think if they already have their ideas about what sort of lives they can aspire to. So point being, well, really, if we do decide that we want to stabilize the population and make it so that people can aspire to be a parent and do something else in the future where parenting is fairer and better, that's a generations level project. It might be, the next generation doesn't do anything different, but they have a little bit of a better time of it, and their kids see that, and they don't even do anything different, but they have a little bit of a better time of it, and their kids see that, and only at the generation level like that do people come to see that, people come to experience from their parents, and then see that parenting would in fact be more feasible for them. But it's not going to be something that's just going to happen. It's a generations level challenge.
And my first question.
Could you talk a little bit more?
Sorry, we neglected to answer the first part of the question. Just very quickly, 2012 wasn't magic in any, there was nothing special that happened in 2012. It was just the year in which the right combination of forces of large cohorts in the past having children while birth rates were falling meant that we just have never reached that peak again of the number of children born in a year.
Just like there's nothing magic about 2084, that's just where the lines might cross.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between economic growth, living standards, longevity, and population growth? I would speculate that measuring the economy, living standards, longevity would track the left-hand side of your chart.
It does, yeah.
And so then, would you expect that we will have falling economic growth, living standards, and longevity on the other side of the curve? And if that is the case, is there a self-governing aspect here that the global population, humanity, will respond to prevent that from happening or to stabilize it at some point?
Okay, so that's I think a 3 or 4-parter. I'll try to go through this quickly. The great news is all of that and more is in the book in longer form. So to give brief answers to all of that, yes, economic growth, and by economic growth, we mean not just fatter paychecks, but people wearing shoes and people in poor places in the world having more to eat, children in the poorest places of the world growing taller, just from 1 year to the next, children born in 1 year to the next are growing taller because they're getting more nutrition, right? That's still happening today. So I want to say that because sometimes we can think of growth, we can get trapped into thinking about growth as like having the newest iPhone, but it really is broadly shared. The historical experience of the world is that although it is of course imperfect, and of course there is still poverty, there is far less poverty in the world than even a few decades ago as growth is unfolded around the world. So yes, that growth is going with population. I mentioned at the beginning of the talk Paul Ehrlich's 1968 book. Since the 1970s, Paul Ehrlich was talking about scarcity of every kind, including the most basic scarcity of food around the world. The world that we live in now is more than twice the size that Ehrlich lived in. Ehrlich told us that the world would starve to death if we added just a few more billion people, that those billions would starve. In fact, what's unfolded over the last half century is that on every continent, we've produced more food. And we produce more food so abundantly that not only are we producing more, but we're producing more per capita, even as our capita, even as the number of people on each continent has been rising by the billions. So yes to all of that. To the question of, do we think growth will end economic growth and well-being, living standards will take a nosedive when the population does. I don't think that will happen in exactly that way. I think that the way to think about what a declining future population means is a future in which growth is slower, where innovation is less, where there's fewer of the people around you wanting the things that you want and causing those things to be made. So I don't think it's the end of positive growth, but I do think it will be a slowdown. And if you think about growth as some destination, and maybe you think, well, we've got everything we need here. I don't actually think that's true. I think there's a lot of people in the world who don't have what they need, and growth would be good. But I also don't think about growth as a destination that once we have just the right amount, then we're fine. I think that there's a future, looking back 75 years ago, and thinking about the lives that people lived, the cures they didn't have that are available to us now, the amenities that they didn't have are available to us now. I could imagine the next 75 years being just as bright in terms of the progress that's made for lives of people around the world. And so I don't think it's the end of growth, but I do think a growth slowdown is something that we should take seriously. And we talk a lot more about this in the book from different angles.
You predict a decline in population, but the world you describe is one in which population is actually still growing. And the thing that seems strange to me is that is how you know that birth rate will continue to decline once populations start to decline.
So we don't think that we're not making any claim about the birth rate continuing to decline. The birth rate that would feel okay. So let's just start there, and then the question is, why would people choose differently in a world that's shrinking? In a world where the next generation is a little bit smaller than the last, the next generation is a little bit smaller than the last. What is going to change in an individual person's life, right? It might be good for the government, it might be good for balancing the books, it might be good for growth. All of these things are externalities. All of these things are benefits to other people. It might be good for all those things if the population were to stabilize. But when, a young person is talking with their spouse or with their significant other about should they have children, that's not what's on their mind. What's on their mind is, what do we want out of our life? What do we feel supported and capable of doing? And it could be that for a very long time, even as the national population shrank, even as the global population shrank, that you could look around as a person deciding about your family and decide, yeah, what's right for me is one kid, what's right for me is 2 kids, what's right for me is no kids, and maybe a few think what's right for me is 3 or more. And if those are the kind of decisions that people make for themselves, for their own lives, and how can we expect them to make any other decisions? Then that's a world in which the population can keep on shrinking. There's no automatic feedback mechanism that impedes on someone's choices for their own life just because it would be convenient for the rest of the world if population decline didn't happen. Right? That's the sort of basic answer, although there's another one we talk quite a bit about it in the book. Thank you so much for being here.